Good morning. So as Joel and Erica mentioned earlier, we're continuing our series on New Vine by Design. We want our church culture not to develop by default, but to develop intentionally to reflect the values of the kingdom. And just to remind you where we've been so far, we've looked at a number of aspects of culture under the banner of our mission, which is reach, grow, and love. And we're doing the first one under the banner of love today, which is caring. And our text for today will be the Good Samaritan in Luke 10, verses 25 to 37. And the difficult thing as a speaker is that the Good Samaritan parable is so well known that we almost fail to see how revolutionary it actually is. It's so familiar, it's become part of our English vernacular. So you call somebody a Good Samaritan when they help out a stranger. It's entered the legal terms. There's Good Samaritan laws that cover whether you can sue somebody that has helped you on the side of the road. And really, we've just reduced it to being nice. And in fact, there's a lot more to it than that. And I came across a great research paper as I was preparing this talk. In the 70s, Princeton Theological Seminary did an experiment on their students. They divided their Masters of Divinity class, their ministry class, into two halves. And they said to them, you have to go from this research office to the auditorium across the campus. And to half the group, they said, you have to give a talk about the job prospects for ministers. And to the other half, they said, you have to prepare a talk about the Good Samaritan. And unbeknownst to both groups, they had an actor playing a beggar and lying in the doorway to the auditorium, pretending to be short of breath and having fainted. And you would think that the half that had been actively thinking about the Good Samaritan Bible passage, the parable, would be more likely to help this beggar than the group who didn't. And what percentage do you think actually helped the beggar? It was around 40%, and it was identical in both groups. So even the group who was actually actively thinking about the parable of the Good Samaritan was no more likely to help than the group that wasn't. And it was a minority, it was 40%. So we need something to shake us out of that complacency, something like this work of art. Some of you might recognize the very distinctive style. It's Vincent van Gogh. This is his rendition of the Good Samaritan. And I think it's a masterpiece because when you look at it, you're jolted out of your complacency. Like you think, yeah, he stopped by the side of the road and helped. But the sheer physicality of the picture here reminds you, what is it like to single-handedly lift an unconscious person on your shoulder, balance them on a donkey, and hold them there for many kilometers till they get to the inn. And suddenly you realize, oh, there's a lot more effort, time, and energy than I had actually pictured. And so what I'm hoping is that today we can kind of jolt ourselves out of the complacency and see this revolutionary teaching of Jesus in a new light. And we'll do that by going through the story together verse by verse and stopping and dissecting it as we go along. And then we'll look at how do we love and care like Jesus. And finally, how do we develop a culture of caring like Jesus? So ready to get started? All right. So let's read the parable together. So on one occasion, an expert in the law, this is a fellow who would have studied the Old Testament Mosaic law, colleagues with the scribes and the Pharisees and all of the priests at the temple. These are the people, just to get into his mindset, who codified all of the Old Testament into 613 different laws. And not only that, but then developed a whole tradition of oral and written teaching called the Mishnah and the Talmud, making commentary on those 613 laws, covering every potential application. So when God said, don't work on the Sabbath, these guys had figured out exactly when does the Sabbath start, when does it end, and what qualifies as work. So is helping a friend work? Is lifting something work? Is helping an animal or taking it out work? So they had nailed down every possibility in this kind of legal thinking for everything around those 613 laws. So that's just to get into the mindset of where he's asking the question from. So the expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And like every good teacher, Jesus turns the question back onto the student and tries to challenge them to answer it. "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind." And so that first bit is actually from Deuteronomy 6:5, which was part of the Shema. So the Shema was the daily prayer that every observant Jew recited morning and night. And it's a passage that starts, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind." So that would have been kind of standard thinking for every observant Jew at the time because they recited it every day. But he continues, "And love your neighbor as yourself." And that bit is actually from Leviticus 19. It says, "Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself, because I am the Lord." And so the lawyer ends up bringing these two together, one that is very familiar to any Jew of the time, but the second one that is perhaps a little more obscure, and he brings them together. And Jesus is actually quite pleased. He says, "You've answered correctly. Do this and you will live." So not only has he given the right answer, but Jesus knows the difficulty here is not just in knowing it, but in doing it. And so he tells the lawyer, "Do this and you will live." But the lawyer wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" And this is where the story gets interesting, because immediately we see the human tendency to want to limit things. Now, these guys were very legalistic, and it's easy to kind of point a finger at them and say how terrible they were. But really, in the end, I think we're no different. Like, it's very easy for us to think, we have limited time, we have limited resources, and there's so much need in the world. Where do we draw the line? Like, who's in, who's out? But I think the danger in wanting to draw a line is that you then call some people in and some people out. It becomes an us versus them. And that's very tribal thinking. And as soon as you get into tribal thinking, the people who are on the outer become the enemy. They're not just those we can forget about, they're the ones who kind of actively oppose us. And we can get a sense of what the lawyer was thinking by looking at this passage from the Jewish wisdom books. Ecclesiasticus is one that's not in our Bible, but it still gives us a sense of how these lawyers were thinking. And the passage reads, "If you do good, know to whom you do it. Give to the devout, but do not help the sinner. Do good to the humble, but do not give to the ungodly." And this really gives you a sense of what tribal thinking is like. You've drawn the line, there are people that are in, people that are out, and the people that are on the inner are people who think like you, live like you, behave like you, talk like you, and so they become your tribe. And you can help them and you can ignore everybody else. And we're familiar with that today. That's not so different than what we have today. We know that social media creates this echo chamber. We suddenly have access to people all over the world who think like us, believe like us, support the things we do, talk like we do, and they become our tribe. And suddenly everybody else becomes the enemy. So Jesus is challenging this kind of tribal thinking. In reply, and so Jesus could easily say to him, "Well, your neighbor is everybody." He could have just stated it plainly. But then the fellow would probably have said, "Oh, that's so idealistic, I'm not even going to listen." And the genius of Jesus now is in spinning this story that kind of slowly draws in the lawyer, almost without him realizing what he's doing. So Jesus starts his story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. And again, we have to stop, because he refers to this very specific road. The lawyer has asked a very general question, who's my neighbor? And yet Jesus talks about this specific road. And you've got to wonder why. And I can't help thinking whether naturally or supernaturally, Jesus knew that this lawyer had walked that road before. It's not a far cry to think, as an expert in the law, he probably would have gone up to Jerusalem to teach seminars, take part in conferences, take part in the temple. And so immediately what he does by using this particular road from Jerusalem to Jericho is that the lawyer is probably thinking, oh yeah, I know that road. I've walked that road. I know what it's like. And so he draws in the lawyer and gets him to identify as the person who's walking that road. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. And I've put up the picture here of what the road looks like from Jerusalem all the way down to Jericho. And you can see how mountainous it is and lots of caves and ridges. And if anybody's watched the old Western movies, you know, there's the caravan walking through, and then there's the ridges on each side where the robbers can jump out and ambush them. It's very much that same kind of terrain. And so as Jesus is telling the story, you can imagine the lawyer is thinking, oh yeah, I've walked that road. I know how dangerous it is. I've felt unsafe myself. I can identify with what this fellow, what's happened to this fellow. And then a priest happened to be going down the same road. So again, let's stop. The lawyer is thinking tribally. He's probably thinking, well, a priest is part of my tribe. If that were me lying by the side of the road, the priest would help me, because he's my tribe. But Jesus surprises him. When he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. And he continues, so too a Levite. And so the lawyer's thinking, well, a Levite is part of my tribe. If that were me by the side of the road, he would stop and help. But again, Jesus says, when he came to the place, saw him, passed by on the other side. Now, Jesus doesn't tell us why they don't stop. And some of the commentaries give them the benefit of the doubt and say that if they were walking in the opposite direction towards Jerusalem, they were probably getting ready to do some kind of official duty in the temple and didn't want to become unclean. Because if they touched somebody that was dead or somebody that was bleeding, they would become unclean. Now, personally, I think that's very charitable of them. Personally, I think it's just fear for their own safety, basically. If somebody's robbed this guy, they could be around the next corner or hiding in the cave, and they could be attacking me. So I'd better get out of here as quickly as I can. So regardless of whether it's fear of becoming unclean or fear of being attacked themselves, fear for their own safety, they don't stop. And Jesus continues the story. A Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. And this is where we have to take a historical detour. So to understand who the Samaritans were, we have to understand a bit of Jewish history. So when we had the 12 tribes of Israel, they were all united for a while they had King David on the throne and while King Solomon was on the throne, and that was kind of the zenith of their power. They were the envy of the world, and everything was going great. But when Solomon died, he handed over the kingdom to one of his sons, who was not a wise person, and through taxation and forced labor, he basically ended up splitting Israel. And 10 of the tribes of Israel went north to form the kingdom of Israel, and the last 2 tribes, Benjamin and Judah, went south to Jerusalem to form the kingdom of Judah. And they were separated for many years. And then finally, the Assyrians came through and completely wiped out the northern kingdom. They basically scattered the Jews that were up there, intermarried with them. They no longer had access to the temple. And so they became, in the eyes of the southern neighbors, their brothers, you know, the last 2 tribes, they became people who were unclean, unworthy, heretics, and heathens. And over time, so the northern kingdom became the Samaritans. And over time, this kind of blood feud developed between the two. Because when the Jews finally, the southern kingdom was conquered by Babylon, and then 70 years later, they were allowed to go back and rebuild their temple. But when that happened, they didn't allow their northern brothers to come and help. It was already set in, this kind of, well, you have to call it racism, had set in so much they didn't even want the 10 tribes who'd been lost to come and help. And so to get a sense of this blood feud, you just have to think of You know, the Irish Catholics versus the Protestants, the Ukrainians versus the Russians, the Turks and the Armenians. Or if that doesn't mean anything to you as the younger generation, then think of Harry Potter with the pure bloods and the mudbloods, if that means more to you. But you get a sense of the kind of blood feud that is set in stone. So when Jesus talks about the Samaritan, he's talking about the enemy here. And it's interesting, I think the lawyer is probably thinking, Jesus, you don't know who the Samaritans are. You don't know what they've done to us Jews, us faithful Jews. And yet Jesus knows exactly what this blood feud feels like, because earlier on in the very same chapter, Jesus and his disciples were coming down Samaria, and the Samaritans blocked him. They didn't let him pass, and he had to go around. So Jesus has already felt what it's like to be part of this blood feud and to be part of this hate. But he doesn't buy into the hate. And just later in this chapter, when we get to this parable, he's still casting the Samaritan as the hero of the parable. So he's making a point here that he's not buying into the blood feud. He's trying to break tribal thinking like he is with the lawyer. Do you follow do you get the sense of the dynamics that are happening here? So Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him, bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Now, 2 denarii means nothing to us today. But apparently 1 denarius was an average day's wage back then. So I went onto the Australian Bureau of Statistics website and looked up what's the average daily wage today in Australia, and it's about $300. So the Samaritan gave about $600 worth in today's terms to the innkeeper to look after the injured man. And not only does he do that, but he gives him an open tab to keep chalking up the expenses over the next few days. So this is not insignificant. $600 is a lot of money. And I think what Jesus is getting at here is kind of reckless, extravagant caring. Like, this is over the top to do to a complete stranger. But this is the challenge that Jesus is extending to each of us. And so Jesus says, which of the 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robber? And so the expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? It's almost like he can't bring himself to say Samaritan because he's such an enemy, he can't even say it. But he recognizes, he says, the one who had mercy on him. And it's interesting because in the Greek, the literal word is to do mercy. And you get the sense that the lawyer has absorbed the point of this parable, like he's understood it. One commentary put it this way: to the lawyer, neighbor was a noun he needed to limit, but to Jesus, neighbor is a verb that we choose to do. And you get the sense that he finally got that. The lawyer, even though he can't speak the word Samaritan, has actually gotten the lesson. And then Jesus delivers the zinger. He says, go and do likewise. You get a sense of how revolutionary this is, how challenging it would have been for the lawyer to do that. And so the question is, how do we love and care like Jesus? I think the heart of this parable is really that Jesus challenges the tribal thinking of the lawyer. And it's more relevant today than ever. Like, we just have to look at the news, look at social media to see how polarized we are. It's right versus left, progressive versus conservative, environmental versus industrialist, conspiracy theorist versus the gullible mainstream. We're so polarized. And the reality is that sometimes it feels like we're in a whole new world, but in fact, this was the same in the ancient world. We just have to look at Paul's letter to the Galatians in chapter 3, He says, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. You get the sense that he was battling tribalism and polarization in the early church back then too. And so I think part of the challenge in this parable is for us to root out tribal thinking in the church, but also in us ourselves. Like, we're not beyond tribal thinking in, you know, are you evangelical or charismatic? Do you like the old hymns or the new worship songs? You know, we find divisions so easily, and it's a challenge to us. And one of the best contemporary analyses I've seen of this is in this book called Kingdom of Rage. The subtitle is The Rise of Christian Extremism and the Path Back to Peace. It's written by Elizabeth Newman, and she was the presidential advisor on counterterrorism, first to President Obama, then Trump, then Biden, and she quit when Trump came in a second time. But basically, her whole career was spent after 9/11 fighting what she thought was extremism, as in Islamic jihadism. And then when, at the end of Trump's first term, fellow Americans stormed Congress, she suddenly realized the radicalism and the extremism is not out there somewhere, it's happened within my own church, within the Christian church. She was a Southern Baptist conservative, and she said, how is it that my fellow Christians are now storming Congress? And she turned all of her skills in counterterrorism and radicalization to try and analyze how is it that the American church has been so divided and so polarized. So it's a fantastic analysis, but in the end, the basic summary, spoiler alert if you're going to read it, is she says the church allowed itself to be shaped by the culture of the world rather than the gospel. And really the only antidote, the only hope we have as a society is to let ourselves be shaped by the gospel again. It's only when we recognize that God is our Father and we are all brothers and sisters in Christ that we can break down tribal lines. And I think what we have in this parable is kind of a master class in how Jesus addresses tribalism on a one-to-one basis. He does it so skillfully, we almost miss what he's doing. So if we recap, what the lawyer started out asking was, who is my neighbor? You get the sense there he's asking from a position of power. He's saying, I have stuff to offer. Who am I going to give it to? Who do I choose to give my love to? And what he does is get the lawyer to identify not as the Good Samaritan, but as the victim. He sees himself, he identifies as the one walking down the road, he knows how dangerous it is, he feels his own people not helping him, and he feels a Samaritan reaching out to him. And in fact, this is our position as Christians. The early church recognized that the Samaritan is actually Jesus, and we are the ones, all of us, laying dead by the side of the road. And so, if you look back at the early commentaries for the first few hundred years of the church, this parable of the Good Samaritan was interpreted allegorically. So, the man is us, the robbers are sin, so sin ravages us and leaves us half dead by the side of the road. The priest and the Levites are the law and the prophets, who, although they recognize sin, can't do anything to help us out of it. The Samaritan is Jesus, who comes to our aid and rescues us when we are caught in sin. The inn that we get taken to is the church. And when the Good Samaritan says he's coming back again, it's the second return of Christ. So this was how the parable was interpreted the first few hundred years. And although this kind of allegorical thinking is frowned upon now, we don't interpret the Bible like that very often nowadays, I think the kernel of truth in it is that we see ourselves as the ones who are ravaged by sin and lying dead by the side of the road, and Jesus is the one who has extended his grace and favor to rescue us. And it's only when we feel that deeply that Jesus says, go and do likewise. Go and be the kind of people who do the same thing for others. And so I think that's the heart of how Jesus fights tribal thinking, and that's how we have to fight it both in ourselves and in the church. Does that kind of make sense? All right, so what is our response now? How can we How can we develop a culture of caring like Jesus? And really, the culture of New Vine is going to be the sum total of all the individual cultures that we each have. You know, every word, every action that we take as individuals contributes to what this whole place looks like and feels like as a culture. And so I think there's 5 things we can kind of take away from this as a response to the parable. One is be aware of tribal thinking on our part, and we've covered that already. The second is be faithful to what God puts in your way and on your heart. And what I mean by that is, sorry, as I was preparing this, I was challenged myself. I was thinking about beggars by the side of the road, and I was reminded of my university days. So I did university in Canada, in Montreal, which is a very large city, and I used to live downtown, and there were lots of beggars. And I remember when I used to come across them, I would be thinking, how much do I have left in my student budget, and how much can I give? And what happens if I meet somebody begging tomorrow and after tomorrow? Do I have enough in my budget to give to each of them? And how much do I give? And do I judge whether they're going to use it properly? Or, like, I was trying to figure out a theology of giving, and I completely forgot the person who was right in front of me. And Jesus in this parable doesn't tell us whether the Samaritan meets a beggar again the next day and the day after that. Does he meet a beggar every time he does that road? He leaves that completely open. I think the point of the parable is the Samaritan responds to the need that God puts in front of him. You don't have to think about the whole theology of giving. You don't have to overthink it. You just have to respond to what Jesus puts in your way and on your heart in front of you. Third is, don't let barriers get in the way. We talked about how maybe it was fear of being unclean or fear for their own safety that stopped the priest and the Levite from responding. But I wonder whether today the greater barriers are hurry. So again, this research paper that I told you I came across, where they divided their ministry class into 2 halves, they did a twist on it. To half of each group, they then said, yes, you have to go from the research office across the campus to the auditorium to give your talk about the future of ministry or about the Good Samaritan Bible. But they also said to half the group, by the way, you're late. They were expecting you a few minutes ago, so you'd better hurry. And what do you think happened when they injected that little bit of hurry? The response rate in terms of helping, thank you, Jeff. The response rate dropped from 40% down to 10%. And that just convicted me, because that happened 2 months ago when I was at the hospital. I was walking across from the palliative care offices to the main hospital, and a woman had fainted in the parking lot. Now, 2 nurses, she was awake, 2 nurses were looking after her, but I thought to myself, I've got 2 patients waiting to see me. I'd better get hurrying rather than keep them waiting, and I did not stop. And suddenly when I read this study, I thought, that little bit of hurry can be enough to stop us from observing God's word. And I kick myself for having done that. Whoops. So I think hurry is probably a bigger barrier now to us than perhaps fear. But the other thing I think in our society is self-absorption, really. We talk to people on our iPhone, we read on our iPad, we listen to music on our iPod. Everything is I, focused around us, and we're completely oblivious. We perhaps don't even see the need that God puts in front of us because we are so self-absorbed. Fourth thing is be extravagant. It's clear that when Jesus says 2 denarii, that's a significant amount of money in that time. It's $600 is a lot for us today. There's a bit of a sting in that extravagant giving. But I think that's part of the point. That's part of the challenge that what Jesus puts to us. It's meant to make us uncomfortable. And I'm reminded of a friend who said, oops, this keeps going back. I'm reminded of a friend who said he was passing by the junction the other day, and there's a woman who begs just outside the Coles. And he thought he'd be nice and offer her a cup of coffee or a sandwich. And he asked her, what did she want? And she said she wanted a whole barbecued chicken. And he thought, well, that's a bit extravagant. That's over the top. But he went away to get it, and he thought, well, I can afford that. And so he got her a whole barbecued chicken, a whole bag of buns, a whole bowl of salad, and took it to her. And she loved it. She was very thankful. And it just reminded that, yes, we can be extravagant. We are a society that has a lot, and it doesn't cost, it doesn't cost us a lot to be extravagant to others. And the last thing, if the music team wants to come up, the last thing that struck me as I was preparing this was really, this is difficult to do because it is spiritual warfare. As Christians, we believe not only do we face this physical world, but there is a spiritual world behind it. And one of the principles of spiritual warfare is that when you are facing a particular spirit, you respond to it in an equal and opposite spirit. So if you're going somewhere where there's a spirit of greed, you respond in generosity. If you go somewhere where there's a spirit of hate, you respond in love. And so I think that we believe there is a spirit of tribalism. You know, the devil loves to divide us. And so there are spiritual forces at work behind this tribalism. And whenever we respond in an act that is anti-tribal, or we care across tribal lines, we are scoring a victory in the spiritual realm. And I can't explain to you how globally helping a beggar outside Coles makes any difference in the state of the world, but at spiritual level it does. Spiritual warfare is fought one tiny act at a time. And it's hard to be caring in this way because it is a spiritual battle. And so I gave away the closing catch. I was going to leave you from the Nike commentary on the New Testament, which is, whoops. I've lost my, just do it. Just do it. The next time God puts a need across your way, don't overthink it. Just respond to what he puts on your heart and just do it. Okay.